Hi guys, so today we're going to start off with A-level microeconomics. So with Edexcel, this will be theme 1. For AQA and OCR, this would be the micro part, of which is usually paper 1 in AS and also at A2. So let's get started. So in the first part, when you look at your specification, you will see that you need to understand that economics is a social science. So what is economics all about? It's about the way that society organizes scarce productive resources in order to satisfy people's wants. Now, you can examine human behavior and combine this with concepts, theories, and techniques now to analyze economic issues and problems. So what we do is obviously we use models to develop theories of behavior. Now, what are these models based on? They're usually based on assumptions, and deductions may be made from the assumptions. So when we build models, we work on the basis that all the other variables are going to be held constant. Now, this term, which we're going to get onto now, is very important throughout your whole A-level curriculum for economics, and this is called ceteris paribus, which basically means that when the effect of a change in one variable is considered, it is assumed that all the other variables are held constant. Okay, so you need to make sure that you really do understand this term, i.e. everything else being equal. Now, it's impossible for economists to conduct lab experiments because we're not scientists. Economics, at the end of the day, is a social science, so it's involving people. Now, people's behavior, which you'll learn later on, is sometimes irrational, and therefore it's impossible to actually predict 100% what economic agents will actually do. So therefore, economic policies have been effective at one time in one country, but that may not have the same impact at another time in another country. So for example, if the United Kingdom economy decreased interest rates, then that does not mean that a decrease in interest rates would work in a country, for example, like Zimbabwe or South Africa. Because firstly, the UK and South Africa are two different countries completely, with different populations, with different GDP, with different contributions to their GDP. So you have to make sure that you make this distinction at the start, that just because you've decreased interest rates in the UK, or you've decreased taxes, or there's been an injection of money going into a certain economy, that does not necessarily mean that it will work in another country. So you have to look at each country on its own merit. So that's the part of social science which you need to make sure that you do understand. The next part of the spec goes onto this whole idea of positive and normative statements. So what are they? Well, a positive economic statement is based on facts that can be proved or disproved. Now, they include what was, is, or will be, and they can be verified as being true or false by reference to the date or by using scientific approach. So they're objective statements based on evidence or facts, which can therefore be proved or disproved. Normative statements, however, are based on value judgments, and they are therefore subjective. So they relate to what may be good or bad, or what should be, ought to be, or would be fair or unfair. Now, we use the word value judgments or subjective, okay, not opinions. So an example of a positive economic statement would be that Joe Biden is going to be inaugurated on Wednesday, and that is a positive statement because he will be inaugurated on the 20th of January. Whereas a normative statement would be, I think or I believe that taxes should be lower. Now, that is obviously my opinion. So that would be a normative statement. So a normative statement is basically an opinion, but you do not use the word opinions when you have to define them in your exams. You'd use the word value judgments or subjective views. Whereas positive economic statements, they can be based on facts and they can be basically proved or disproved. So that's the main part on positive and normative economic statements. And then we move on to the main part, which was a recurrent theme over this whole A-level economics, which is what is the economic problem? Now, all societies will face the problem that wants are infinite, but resources are limited in supply. And this is basically the underlying reason for the fundamental economic problem of scarcity, okay, where therefore choices have to be made. Now, the issue of scarcity means that societies will have to answer a series of questions. For example, what do you produce and how much do you produce? So this relates to the different types of goods and services that the economy should produce and how much of each. How should the goods and services be produced? Production may be, for example, labor intensive, so we may need more laborers, or another production of any other type of goods, they may be technology intensive. How should the goods also be produced, be allocated? This is concerned with the distributions and how will they affect the distribution of equality in the societies. So, when you're approaching your examinations, this is a very common question, especially in the AS papers, where they'll say, how do you define the economic problem? And this is the order that you should actually answer the question. So you should answer the question where wants are infinite but resources are limited in supply, and that is the reason for the economic problem of scarcity. Now remember, how do you define scarcity? Well, scarcity exists because resources are finite, whereas wants are infinite. So that would be the main definition for scarcity. And that would be the main definition also for the economic problem. Moving on to resources. So resources are what we are referred to as factors of production. So when you do see in your exams the word resources, just think factors of production. And there's 4 factors of production in total, which you need to make sure that you know the definitions of. So there's land, labor, capital, and enterprise. So what are they? Well, land, it includes all natural resources, raw materials, the fertility of the soil, and resources found in the sea. Labor refers to those involved in the production of goods and services and includes all human effort, both physical and mental. Capital is any man-made aid to production, including factory building, offices, machinery, IT equipment, and which is used to make other goods and services. And enterprises, they basically have 2 functions, or what we call entrepreneurs. They're bringing together the other factors of production so that goods and services can be produced. But also, they are the risk takers. They are taking the risks involved in the production. So an entrepreneur is basically somebody who will take all the other factors of production, land, labor, capital, as well as their own ability, which is the risk taking, to bring together all of them and to produce goods and services. Now, moving on to the next part, which is renewable and non-renewable. So you do need to know the difference between both of these. So some resources are renewable, which means that they're replaced naturally after use, such as solar, wind power, wood, and fish. Such resources are likely to be sustainable unless they're consumed more quickly than they can be replaced. Other resources are non-renewable, so continued consumption will eventually result in their exhaustion, such as oil, platinum, and copper. Now we're going to move on to the next part, which is opportunity cost. Now opportunity cost is incredibly important concept that really every economist, even when you study this beyond A level or if you go to university, opportunity cost is a very, very prevailing concept that you'll always be using in general life. Now, we did see in the first couple of slides where scarcity implies that choices have to be made. Now, each choice will involve an opportunity cost. So what is opportunity cost? Opportunity cost is basically just defined as the next best alternative that is forgone when a choice has been made. So there's always going to be a real cost measured in terms of something that is forgone. So for example, a consumer, let's say that you have £100 and you decide that you want to buy £100 worth of books, or you could spend £100 on an Apple product. So if you choose that you're going to decide to spend that £100 on the Apple product, well then therefore the opportunity cost will be on that you could have spent that money on those books. So that is how you've got to have a look at opportunity cost, and that is for all economic agents. So economic agents are the main people in the economy, for example, consumers, firms, producers, and also additionally for governments. Now, if you want to think about it in the sense of how does a government have an opportunity cost issue? Well, think about when the governments have limited budgets. Money cannot always be spent everywhere. So, for example, if the government had to make a decision of whether to spend more on defense or education, and they decided to spend more on education, then the opportunity cost would be in defense or any other part of departments that they could have spent on. So that's a bit of a brief introduction to opportunity cost, but we will look into this a little bit more later on. Another distinction that you've got to look at is the distinction between economic goods and free goods. Now, economic goods are basically created from resources that are limited in supply, so they are scarce. So consequently, they're going to command a price. Free goods, though, are unlimited in supply, such as sunlight or sand on a beach. So consumption by one does not limit consumption by others. So therefore, the opportunity cost of consuming a free good would be zero because you don't have to give anything up. Whereas an economic good, there's always going to be an opportunity cost because that money that you could have spent on one good, you could have spent it on another good. Now, another important concept that we talk about in economics quite a lot is something called the PPF, which is the Production Possibility Frontier, or it may be known for you as PPB, which is Production Possibility Boundary, or PPC, Production Possibility Curve. Either way, they're all the same thing. Now, what do they do? Well, a PPF depicts the maximum productive potential of an economy using a combination of two goods or services when resources are fully and efficiently employed, and they can show the opportunity cost of using the scarce resources. So, what is the curve? So you'll see on the left-hand side of the page, where you've got on the horizontal axis, you've got consumer goods, which is the x-axis, and the y-axis, which is the vertical, is capital goods. And then you have basically a concave shape, and you've got some letters on there, A, B, C, D, and E. Now, if you're producing on points A and B, they are the most efficient combinations of output on the PPF. Now, producing at point B, if we just focus on that, what does that mean? Well, producing at point B means that you're producing more consumer goods than capital goods, which incurs, therefore, by definition, an opportunity cost of producing more capital goods. Because if B just moves a little bit higher onto the concave shape, it could have produced more capital goods, but therefore it would have to give up producing consumer goods. So there is always going to be that opportunity cost between both of them, and you can label the x and the y axis whatever you like. They could be, for example, an iPad and an iPhone. Now, producing at C or D, which is inside the concave shape, is inefficient, or what we call unemployment in macroeconomics, and resources are not used to their full productive potential. Now, there is a potential to use these resources more efficiently, which would shift production closer to the curve. So, we are going to talk about how do you get from C to D to being on the point of A and B. And producing at E, currently, at the moment, that is not yet attainable with the current resources. So, what is this curve? So when we draw the PPF curve, what do we assume? Well, we assume two things. We assume that firstly, there's a fixed amount of resources are used. So remember, resources are factors of production, land, labor, capital, and enterprise. So there's a fixed amount that doesn't change. And there is a constant state of technology. So the PPF, what it can also depict is economic growth or decline. So only production under and on the PPF is attainable, and production outside the PPF is not obtainable. So, however, production on the PPF does use the resources efficiently. Now, an increase in the quantity or quality of resources in the PPF shifts outward. So the PPF of the economy increases, and therefore there is economic growth. So when there is a shift from PPF 1 to PPF 2, this means that there has been economic growth, Okay, the economy has grown. And how can this happen? This can happen through either an increase in the quantity of resources, so quantity of labor. You may have immigration, which could also increase the PPF. You could have an increase on entrepreneurs, which can also increase the PPF. Or you can increase the quality of your resources. So for example, technology improves. So therefore, on a ceteris paribus assumption, assuming everything else stays the same and there's a technology improvement, therefore the PPF would shift to the right. Now, mainly this can all be achieved by the use of supply side policies, which we do get into much later on into the course. But supply side policies is basically policies to shift or to increase the aggregate supply of the whole economy. So this is all very, very important, especially when you are doing essays and when you're answering questions, that you actually understand this whole concept, because the PPF can be used to illustrate many things. It can be used to illustrate opportunity cost. It can be used to illustrate economic growth. It can be also illustrate to show unemployment. So if you're inside the PPF, it'll be unemployment. If you're on the PPF, that means that you're allocatively efficient. If you're outside the PPF and you want to try and get there, then providing that you increase the quantity and or quality of resources, therefore you'd get the shift in the PPF, which would therefore mean that you would have economic growth. So what is the difference between moving along the PPF and shifting the PPF? Well, moving along and shifting are two different things. So moving along the PPF will use the same number and state of resources and shift production from fewer consumer goods to more capital goods, for instance. Okay, and that incurs the opportunity cost. However, shifting the PPF curve outwards, that will be using more resources or resources of a greater quality. And again, this would reduce the opportunity cost. So the main distinction that you do need to know is what's the difference between capital goods and consumer goods. So capital goods are goods which can be used to produce other goods, for example, machinery. And consumer goods are goods which can be used to produce other goods, such as clothing. Now, what you will find if we go back one slide, and you'll see this sort of shape, which is a concave shape. So on this diagram on the left, you'll see that there's a concave shape. This is a diagram that's showing increasing opportunity cost. So, there's a lot of questions, especially with multiple choice questions, where they'll show you a diagram of a PPF and they'll say to you, well, what type of opportunity cost is this shape? So when it's a concave, it's increasing opportunity cost. And when it's basically just a straight line, that is when opportunity cost is constant. So that is the end of this part of where we talk about the introduction of economics. So if we just quickly go through what we've actually been through. So if we go back from the beginning, where we talk about economics is a social science, and we're using this whole idea of ceteris paribus assumption in building our models. So we're basically saying that if we keep everything else constant and we're just focusing on one in absolute. And then we move on and we sort of talk about, positive and normative economic statements. So positive statements can be based upon facts and normatives are basically opinions. And then we move on to our factors of production, our resources, land, labor, capital, enterprise, where it's important to make sure that you do know those definitions. And coupled with that, it's the economic problem, where we have this whole issue of scarcity. Okay, where because resources are finite, but everyone has infinite wants, therefore agents have to make choices. We have to make choices in deciding what to produce, how to produce, whom to produce it for, and how should those goods and services be produced. So that is the main thing. And then we move on to renewable and non-renewable resources, where it is important that you do know the distinction between both of them. And then we go on this whole idea of opportunity cost and the PPF, where opportunity cost is the best alternative for gone, and the opportunity cost can be depicted or shown via a PPF diagram, the production possibility frontier. And again, the PPF is one of the most important diagrams in A-level economics. Most schools and colleges do not emphasize on this much, but to my students, I do emphasize this a lot, where I do say that the PPF is something that you really, really should make sure that you understand, because you can use it to illustrate so many things. You can illustrate it to show economic growth. You can also show it to show economic decline of growth. If we go back and we have a look at that of this slide, and we have a look at and say that, well, if PPF2 was going inwards to PPF1, well, that would be when there's maybe a natural disaster, an earthquake, a hurricane, or huge amounts of decline in economic growth. A PPF can show that. And also, if you're operating within the PPF, so points C and D, this can be shown as unemployment of resources. So the PPF diagram is not just important for microeconomics, it can be also used for macroeconomics. After this, next we will be moving on to the next part, which is in the spec, which is all about specialization and division of labor, and we'll then carry on with the continuation of microeconomics for the A-level syllabus. So leave any of your questions and comments below. If there's anything that you would like me to cover specifically, then please just reach out to me and I'll be happy to reach it. But until then, I will catch you on the next video. Thank you.